It's with a little bit of sadness that I bring you the last episode. I don't know if it's sadness for our guest, Peter Compo. Welcome
Hey,
back.
this has been a great number of sessions we've had. I've really appreciated the time you've put into this.
It's great, man. And there's the book for people, The Emergent Approach to Strategy. I'm sure if you're still with us, you're into this stuff. So great to have you. And speaking of being into this stuff, I have this idea on the show where if you have questions when I have a multiple time guest like Peter here, please send those questions to me. And I got sent a question like that. And for full disclosure, I know this guy, Ed Melvin, sent me in this question. He said, "Can you ask Peter this question?" I said, "Why don't you ask him? Send me a WhatsApp video of that and ask him yourself." So I'm going to play that video from Ed. Peter's going to answer that. And if in the future, for example, of a series coming down the line with Henry Mintzberg, another series coming down the line with Gary Hamill, send your questions. Please do. I might not get to them all, but send them by video and I'll include them on the show as well. So you can feature on the show. Peter, I'm going to play this little excerpt here from Ed and get your answer.
Peter, I'm a big believer in the emergent approach. The question I have relates to strategic leadership and what guidance you can offer on holding the line with emergent strategy. I found often stakeholders can be spooked because they've agreed in theory to the emergent approach, but in practice, it can feel reactionary. It can feel off strategy. So that's when, in my experience, trust in the leadership is vital. So, what advice can you offer strategic leaders on ensuring the team holds the line on emergent strategy? Thanks.
It's a good question because managing by the principles, managing by rules is much harder than managing by goals. Okay, you didn't hit your goals, so we know it was wrong. Well, managing by rules, by the theory of the case is much harder. And I think the number one thing is to engage the people in the design in the first place. That what it's really about is internalizing the reasons for the theory of the case, the reasons for the strategy. If everybody's on board for the reasons, if everybody has been part of that design, if they've worked through it, the struggle, then it becomes their design too. And if it becomes their design too, it's not just the leader who has to say, hey, wait a minute. This is what we said was the truth about this. We got to hang in there. We got to stay with it, even though we've hit some road bumps here, even though we've hit some turbulence. So I think that is by far the single greatest way to get people to be able to work in an emergent way versus a deterministic planned type of thinking. Involve everyone. The way I say it in chapter 11 is make it the people's design. And one of the key ways to do that is you have to extend the process in time. Extend in time to make it the people's design because so many of the important people in an organization on the front lines in all parts of the company can't drop everything and just go work on a 5-week strategy process. So instead, extend it in time, make it part time, develop it as an organization. Then everybody will be in the process, will feel like their voice was heard. They've heard others, they've been part of the design. And when it's your design, you can live it. You're better able to live it. You're better able to stick with it during the turbulence.
And you become positive version of the IKEA effect where you fall in love with this thing because you were part of building it in the first place. I wanted to add a little adjunct there. There's a little bit of, call it the blockbuster late fee dilemma, where it's like, I know my customer doesn't like this thing, but I make a lot of money from it. So what I would hear also there from Ed, and this is not, I'm not indicating this is what he was saying, but what I would say you hire a media company who offers strategy. The old approach was they would come to you and go, we want a strategy to enter the market this way. And you go, great. And your expertise and what you charge the money for, like the late fee, is to go away and come back and go ta-da with the strategy. And that's one of the challenges, isn't it? And this actually speaks to something we might mention later on is the rewards problem. it's the reward or the recognition of where the value is that actually needs to be
Mm.
rewritten.
Well, on your first part, that they come in with their expertise, there's 3 levels of consultant work, right? There's the ones where they do it for you, and even worse is the ones where they do it to you. I felt that way often. It wasn't even doing it for you, it was like putting it on you in a way that you weren't even part of the thought process. And of course, what we want is with you, that consultants bring it with you. And it may involve complete different views of what's valuable and what's important. That's a whole question around how consultants can do the best work for companies. And it depends on a lot of things, how you might approach it. Unfortunately, most consultants, especially the well known ones, are very expensive. And the last thing anybody wants is for them to hang around for a long time. And then when I would say to them, hey, wait a minute, instead of, so, okay, if money's the issue, why don't we just spread the time that you're with us over a longer period? Charge us the same and make it 8 months instead of 8 weeks. And they said, well, it's really difficult to schedule that. We got all of our young people that sleep on the couches and stay overnight and order in food. And I'd say, you guys are billion-dollar consultants. You advise the biggest companies in the world. You advise governments. You advise militaries, and you're telling me you can't figure out a way to spread out your workforce over time?
That idea of extending time is key. There's only so much mental capacity people have for change, so many items of change they can handle at one time. And that becomes even more pronounced. And I wanted to mention this before we get today is about execution and practice. And we're not going to get through all that we have on the slate, but we'll get through as much as possible. You really have to read the book and you really have to take your time and extend in time, like we did with this episode as well. I want to say as well, that's why Peter was so gracious to allow me to read it extend in time, because it's not a book that you read on your holiday in a week. It's a book that you read over a long period of time, and you need that opportunity to let the concepts marinate and to try and really learn them. It's a book that you learn that way. It's a playbook. You do a great job with the anecdotes. And one of those is this idea of how do you manage things when things get into crisis mode or you're under stress? And as you said, a huge factor that separates people or organizations who are brilliant at execution from those who are average is the ability to keep working and stick to disciplines in the heat of the battle. Brilliant execution means maintaining discipline despite the stressors of mental and physical fatigue or emotional conflict or fear. And I say that for a couple of reasons. I'd love you to expand on it. Is most organizations wait until change is thrust upon them rather than actually going and getting ahead of that change. And the mindset is totally different. You're in fight or flight mode, literally, and your decision making is flawed, versus you do it when you're going to be more open to the flaws and the missteps that you make as you emerge your way towards
I think
success.
you've said it very well. Crisis is the easiest situation so many times because you have no choice. You have no choice to take action, and your actions might be flawed, but who's going to argue? At least you got to do something, right? I was recently involved with a board, and a CEO was new, coming into a financially difficult situation. And everybody was saying, boy, this is the toughest thing to come into something like this. And I'd say, "Well, I think it's quite the opposite. You can come in and say everybody else was a moron and just say, okay, now I'm going to fix it, right? Oh, everybody else got into this mess. I'm the one who's going to make it right." So, crisis is such a gift in some ways to leaders, isn't it? But who would argue that leaders who see things before who try to dig into the reality of the situation and the potential for bad things to happen ahead of time and design for that and prepare for that, who would argue that that's not a better way to lead? It's just tough to do. It's very hard to do. And especially when you've got a board and you've got stockholders and numbers have to be what they are, it's a great challenge. But I think this is a true leader, one who can see it before it happens, who can help the organization see it, or even better, help the organization learn how to see it for themselves, to become aware of what's going on and the potentials for things to be bad, worse, or better than they are. And this becomes an ongoing process of strategy work, of an ongoing process of learning. Not a magic 6 to 8 week strategy program where you create your PowerPoint charts and then everybody goes back to their office. No, something where there's an ongoing struggle.
And as you say, and I think this is so important, that stressors can also come from success. And I'm going to quote this. I loved what you said here. Euphoria seduces people away from execution as easily as duress. Military strategist Colin Gray quotes Clausewitz, warning of the perils of our apparent success, and shows how military success can drive countries. Sorry, I'm after skipping too far ahead. How military success can drive countries down the wrong road, calling it victory disease. I absolutely love that. Or Tom York, the leader of Radiohead, for people who know who that is, said in a much more direct way, as soon as you get any success, you disappear up your own arse.
If you consider execution to be the discipline of staying with your theory of the case, with staying with your strategy framework until there's something clearly is wrong with it, so you have to modify it. Well, then I believe it absolutely true that success can destabilize just as much as duress. How many people have had a good thing happen by chance out of the blue and they think that's it? They did it. They created it. And now that's their new world versus saying, well, let's live with this a little bit. Hey, put it in the bank and let's see what happens the next year and see if it's the same. So this all gets to what is execution. It's not getting good results. It's not operational excellence. It's the discipline to stay with what you said was the truth, your strategy framework.
It's funny, man. I was thinking about this the other day. I was running a workshop for a group of 80 people, and so I had so many great compliments afterwards. And people were like, going, "How did you didn't look at any notes, or you didn't look at your slides?" And I ran the day from 10 until 5 p.m. And they were like, "How do you do it?" And because of our conversations, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about what we talked about sport or about Charlie Parker. And I didn't say, I didn't comment and go, I just said thank you. But actually, it's the discipline, because every day I read, every day I write, every day I talk to great people like yourself. I'm having conversations in this world. And that's the discipline that then makes it look effortless when you're running a workshop all day, because that's all people see. They see the Friday night lights, but they don't see the dirty training that you're getting down and doing sitting over there on that chair, pointed over here to my chair where I read and doing the work, writing, etc. They don't see
Right.
that. They see the front end stuff, it was really just helpful to see that after our conversations gave me a new lens to see that as well. But to your point, I don't. Anytime I have a successful thing like that, I go great, chalk it down, as the All Blacks say, celebrate your victories, but
Mhm.
forget them quickly. Remember your
Yeah.
losses more than your wins. And I love that mantra, because it's actually this idea that don't become complacent. And it speaks to one other thing you said, and I'd love you to riff on. You said experience as pedestrian as boredom can drive people away from the discipline of execution, especially when processes are proceeding smoothly.
Yeah, I experience that myself often where if you're trying to create things writing. I write music and I'm writing scientific work. I'm continuing to write on strategy. It really becomes a chore after a while, right? The drone of this constant editing and writing and drafting and editing and writing. I think it can take you away from a discipline. I think it can take you away from being sure you're writing what you really, really need to say and being sure you really are saying something meaningful and not just filling up the strategy world with more noise and, and more of the same. And in businesses, perhaps this is also something very, very true. It's very hard to be repetitive and stick with it properly. And I'm sure in sports, you could give many examples of the repetitive nature of training where it's tough to get off. It's easy to get off your discipline because of how boring it really is.
I tell my kids this with maths, like, you learn the 7 times table, so you don't actually have to ever think about it, and you come in at the level above it, and then you learn that level above it, and then you go up, and you make them implicit, and then you don't have to ever think about them, and that's the beauty of the discipline. But as you said, then you kinda get bored and kinda go, "I want a bigger challenge," because 'cause we're designed that way. I thought we'd better you said about the discipline of repeating the same idea over and over. One of the things that you apologize for is birthing a new TLA, three-letter acronym, which is the SAM. Now, the SAM was the focus of the last episode. And one of the things we wanted to talk about was evolving the SAM a little. And I wanted to segue between that and scenarios. The first I heard about scenario planning was actually a guy called Art Kleiner I had on the show. It was one of the first multi-part series we did, and he wrote a book called The Age of Heretics, and he talked about Shell's scenario impresario Pierre Wack,
Yes.
and he wrote this little piece. I thought I'd share it with you as a little bit of color. He said scenarios were supposed to be fictional and playful, not some sort of rigorous forecast. The point was not to make accurate predictions, although, like all futurists, he loved to be right, but to come up with a mythic story that brought the point home. That narrative quality was one of the things that impressed most people back then. One of the things that he saw that he could bring to Shell. So, Shell were one of the companies that brought the whole idea of scenario planning to life. Shell managers needed to understand the forces that had been produced to create the sudden upset of the Libyan oil crisis. They needed an intellectual maverick who could speak to Shell managers throughout the world to help them learn how to be prepared before the crisis struck. One of these people worked in Paris as the director of economics research for Shell Française, the French operating company. He was unique within Shell, a former magazine publisher trained in spiritual disciplines and government administration, familiar with Japan and India, and knowledgeable about Shell's business problems. He was also a magnetic man, the sort of man who people intuitively felt they could understand. His name was Pierre Wack. Now, I did an episode on Pierre Wack, but I just wanted to share that because it was interesting because I was like going, I covered scenario planning before. I looked back on those notes and then I overlap both. And I said they overlap nicely. There's lots of threads in there that Peter can pull on and then mix with the other Peter, Pierre Wack.
We should just quickly say that Shell Corporation was one of the early adopters and developers of scenario thinking, but Rand Corporation. Now, I give a little history in my book if you're interested in a reference. Rand Corporation, where the nuclear environment was having them explore possibilities. And for example, mutually assured destruction was one of the scenarios that they were studying. So it came from two places, interestingly enough. And the other background I would say is that so we talked about the SAM, the emergent approach practice, the way to design strategy is an emergent method, but it's built around a strategy alternative matrix where alternatives to consider are inherent in the process. And another thing is that scenarios are inherent in the process. And what I want to say about the most important point I want to make about scenarios is that I believe leaders treat them as something only for these huge questions, these big deals of not nuclear war, but for them, but 25-year macroeconomic questions, or what would be the impact of war in the Middle East, for example. These kinds of questions. And I'm saying, yeah, those are might be important to you. I don't know. They may or may not be important, but scenarios can be used in a much more down to earth way. I used to say often, hey, what about next Tuesday? Are we sure about everything coming up by next Tuesday? Scenarios can be made practical, small scale, not a big futurism discussion, but down to earth questions around things like, are we sure our strategy will be robust to interest rates, or that it would be robust to a competitor action that's different, or whether or not market interest changes for our products? You name it, but simple things. What's been missing, I believe, and something that I believe I've solved or brought back into strategy, is how to bring scenarios into the strategy matrix. It's very easy to conceive of big scenarios and to do a scenario planning process, but they tend not to be part of a real strategy process where scenarios are inherent in evaluating your alternatives, your strategy alternatives. And so I think my number one message on scenarios is that it is inherent in all work that there are going to be multiple plausible futures. And it doesn't have to be a big futurism study to get them to be part of your thought process.
I'm going to share, Peter, on the screen the SAM, and the SAM becomes three-dimensional when you add scenarios. And again, all these diagrams are on Peter's website, theemergentapproach.com, and also in the book. Peter, maybe you'll take us through this just again with a bit of empathy for those who are just
Yes.
listening.
So on the left-hand face of this cube, you see the basic strategy alternative matrix. And the essence of that is you have alternatives that you're considering that will bust your bottleneck, that will solve what's in the way of achieving your aspiration. And then you'll see fitness criteria by which you evaluate those alternatives. Now, strategy matrix is not a brand new thing, but the emergent approach has a strategy matrix that is not all numbers and not all words, and has very, very precise design criteria, design principles, and design criteria by which you can construct it. But it remains very simple. One of the dilemmas in using scenarios is that in principle, they do create a third dimension, meaning for each strategy alternative that you would evaluate, you have to evaluate it against different environmental futures that you would be living and working and implementing in. But until we develop some fancy software, it can be simplified. And I give many examples of how to simplify this to keep it two-dimensional and keep that third dimension from making it seem like a wild science project there. But the important point is that it does add effort to ask the question, for each one of my alternatives that I'm considering for my strategy, how would they play out against these various scenarios? Even if you have two that you want to look at, high and low interest rates. If I had said this 3 years ago, people would say, interest rates, who cares? They'll never be high again, right? How many businesses and stock prices change dramatically because of the interest rate change?
One of the things that you say you should not do is create a strategy for every scenario. And we've been advised the opposite of that. I thought about that. I was like, going through scenario planning alone is a
Oh,
huge cognitive load on an executive. and then to have to create a strategy for every one of those
But actually,
scenarios.
you said it right the first time, right? The idea that each scenario gets its own strategy is missing completely the point of scenarios. And I give the example in the book of gambling, right? It would be like saying, okay, if anybody knows the game of craps, if you roll a 7 or 11, you win right away. And if you roll a box car, if you roll snake eyes, you lose right away, right? And then if you don't roll any of those, you got to keep rolling until you get what you need. The idea of each scenario gets its own strategy, but would be like saying, I'll bet after I find out whether I roll a 7, 11, or a 2. You don't have the right to wait till the outcome to find out what your strategy should be. All strategies your strategy is at the mercy of all future scenarios. Whether you discover them, whether you articulate them, whether you even care. Because there's many cases that you could create a strategy that says, well, if interest rates go up, it might have this effect, but I don't care. I'm going to accept that because I think if we plan for it, if we put in something that reflects that, it's going to hurt us elsewhere even more. So this is, I think, often said. I've even found it said in the literature. Create a strategy for each scenario. It misses the entire point. The entire point is that you're going to have to walk down the road, and the world you walk in could be different things than you thought. And so your strategy has to consider that possibility.
You say then as well, you can choose a strategy alternative that ignores all but one scenario, but futures don't go away just because they are ignored.
Absolutely. And again, this will come to leaders who are scared away of thinking about scenarios because they think it's a big futuristic process that doesn't really connect with their reality. Do a quick process. Get a few people who know something about the market. Have them list a few things that they think could happen, even fairly low probability. 5%, 10%. Is that so low? You can choose to dismiss them, but at least you wrote them down. At least you said, we chose to dismiss these things. Put that on your dashboard. Look at it once a quarter and say, well, did we do the right thing by choosing to ignore these?
We often just plow on, don't we? It's one of the reasons I was telling you, Annie Duke was on the show about her book, Thinking in Bets. And I thought it was useful to release that in the middle of this series. And the reason was one of the exercises she does with executives is get them to vote exactly to your point and to capture that vote. And importantly, she uses an electronic way of doing that so nobody can see. I'll wait to see what
Right.
Peter says. Does he say yay or nay? And then I'll cast my vote. So it takes away groupthink and it takes away also the pressure, the social pressure that comes sometimes with I better vote for what my boss voted for, whatever it might be. But most importantly, then to revisit and go, what did we think would happen? And then what happened? And then to examine why they got it right or got it wrong. And we just go on. We just go on with life. Like you said, you might have the
Yep.
hot
Yep.
fallacy. You might think, oh, I made a great bet. And one of the things she said, which was brilliantly, was so people thought they were brilliant at property development, buying old houses, doing them up until '08. And then '08 changed all of that.
Absolutely. And I think that what Annie does is bring to life kind of fundamentals of what essentially in some ways are scenarios. That you get a hand. If you've ever watched her play, and there's so much of this Texas Hold'em on YouTube or whatever, and you start with a hypothesis about what everybody else's hand might be, or how you should play your hand based on what they possibly could have, and then as you get more information, you start to formulate your theories even more clearly. What I'm trying to do with this very simple strategy alternative matrix that it can incorporate scenarios and that stays on one page. It's not a 55-page PowerPoint deck. It stays on one page and much more talk and debate and less writing. How to incorporate that kind of thinking that she's bringing to executives into your actual strategy process. That's really very much the
One
nature
of the
of evolving the SAM as I've laid it out.
one of the last things I wanted to share, Peter, on this, and we'll move on to bottlenecks again, back to bottlenecks, is to avoid probability distributions. And just to explain what you mean by that.
I think it's very tempting for people to think in terms of most likely cases. They want to be able to say, all right, sure, there's variance, sure, there's possibilities, but come on, let's be tough business people here and pick a most likely case, and then we'll get to work, right? But the first one here is showing even if the case is the most likely case, that doesn't mean it's very likely at all. There could be a whole lot of cases that are almost as likely. And if you put a spinner on this, right, and rolled the dice on that with that probability distribution, you have the probability of getting many. You have the high probability of getting many different rolls. And then, of course, if you've got cases that are bimodal, for example, will a regulatory law get put in or not? Could change your world dramatically. There's no most likely case there, unless you can argue that it's a 2% chance that that regulation won't go in. Well, what if it's a 20% chance? Then now you have a bimodal probability. And I think that we've got to move away from most likely thinking and move to the possibility of multiple plausible futures that even if it's 10, 15% in your mind, you have to ask yourself, if that happens, is it really going to be to the negative? And should I design a way to live with that? You don't have to. Again, there's nothing that says you have to design for all futures. Sometimes you just want to say, I think the greatest probability is this, and I'm going to design for that, and I'm going to take my lumps if it doesn't happen. That's a very fair, rational process.
The lumps, I mean, I think when I was reading about that, I thought about how once my son, when he was only a baby, came home and we were doing coloring. He was only like 5 or 6, so he was just in school. He had this teacher in school who was a battle axe of a teacher. She had the kids terrified. So he was coloring, and he pushed over his sheet to me for me to color. I was only coloring with him. Now I have to say I enjoyed it a little bit, but I was coloring with him. The whole idea is I was with him. I was present. I was mentally present. And he pushed over a sheet. Will you finish mine? Because he was looking at mine going, and I was like, going, maybe I'm doing it a bit too well and I'm making him feel like inferior in some way. But actually, what he was afraid of, I got to the end of, the teacher had the class fearful of leaving white spots.
Oh,
And she had this line, it's an Irish, she spoke in Irish, and she said, no sputty bana,
no
which
way.
means no white spots. And I was like, I thought about when I was reading this, that came to mind, and I was like, that's because in organizations, you put your neck out and you go, here's my scenario
Mhm,
that I think might happen. And if the organization is of a sputty bona
mhm.
temperament, they're going to make you feel like crap for that. And then you're going to take your lumps, and then you're not going to put your neck out again. And then the organization wonders why people aren't
Yep,
being
yep.
innovative and coming up with
Isn't this
scenarios.
part of what Annie is trying to teach on a very fundamental level? Someone makes the case and that it could even be a 40% probability. Of course, nobody knows the exact probabilities, a belief, a rationale, a story, and it doesn't come true. Did you fail? Well, this is again the whole question around execution. If you had a really good theory, if you really worked that theory and got the right people involved with it, and you stuck with it, and it turned out not to succeed, did you fail? Or did you play the
Uh,
probabilities and the dice came up wrong? You know, if you only got one shot, you can't take a chance. Or, well, whoever gets a situation where you're guaranteed of success. Of course, this is nonsense. I think I say it all the time. This nonsense of failure is not an option is just pure idiocy. I document that failure is not an option in the U.S. intervention in Iraq. It was written in the strategy for Iraq. You can see this in chapter 8. What do you mean failure wasn't an option? Um, but getting back, if you're playing the percentages, it's assumed you're going to play many times, many hands, right? And execution is to stick with that and and not be
Stick with the game
seduced
plan.
and change the game plan if you see that there's a fallacy in it, which is a big part of strategy work. Once you see a fallacy, go back and modify it.
So true, man. From battle axes to bottlenecks. So we've established that bottlenecks are the glue that holds frameworks together, especially, well, any framework, but especially the emergent approach that Peter talks about. Bottlenecks are discovered and articulated, not designed. I think that's such an important line. They exist whether discovered or not. They are a property of the dynamics of the system. There is no simple discovery formula, and the only way to be confident of your bottlenecks is to evolve the SAM as a whole or even begin implementation. You got to play that card in order to start to discover the bottlenecks. Maybe you'll evolve on what I
Yeah,
was saying there.
before we talk about bottlenecks specifically, could I just give a comment about the overall spirit of designing strategy and designing and using this strategy alternative matrix to discover the strategy alternative that you believe to be right, the theory of the case you believe to be right. And that is, I liken it to a puzzle. It's not a recipe. It's not following sequential steps where you say, do an environmental scan, pick a goal, choose a goal, decide on what might be in the way, devise plans, devise a strategy, devise metrics. And you see these things in chevrons or in boxes with arrows on them. Uh, the the approach I teach here is to think of it much differently. Think of it as a puzzle where there is no exact start point. You can start almost anywhere. It's a matter of slowly finding pieces that fit together. But it's a real life puzzle, unfortunately, where you'll never have all the pieces. That's the old joke about sometimes you have to make a decision without all the data. Oh, tell me a time you ever made a decision with all the data. There is no data from the future. You'll never have all the pieces. Sometimes pieces change shape. You don't know exactly where the boundaries are, and they may change. Sometimes somebody comes up and crumples up half the puzzle and says, sorry, wasn't right. And most of all, there's no picture on a box top that tells you what you're aiming for. You have to discover it. You have to find it. And this, I believe, is a much more compelling image of how to design and how to be creative and how to innovate than following prescribed steps. And what holds it together as a process is design principles, the definitions of the framework components, and how they relate to each other, and all that's laid out. And one that's perhaps the most important, as you brought in, was the bottleneck. What bottleneck are these strategy alternatives aiming to bust, to take away, so that we can achieve our aspiration that we believe to be the aspiration we want to achieve? And you said that it was the glue, and I believe it very much to be the glue that what strategy and innovation and making change is all about is the relationship between several constraints. An aspiration is a constraint that tells you the space you want to be in and some features of that space. The bottleneck is the system constraint that's in in the way of you just having it. You can't just have an aspiration. If strategy was just a matter of articulating an aspiration and everybody agreeing on it, we're going to grow in this country, or we're going to improve profitability, or we're going to win more games, we wouldn't even need the strategy industry, right? So you can't just do those things. So, yeah, you ask, what is constraining us? What is keeping us from having that? And then the strategy being a self imposed constraint, an enabling constraint that attacks that bottleneck to achieving the aspiration. And I call that the triad. We talked about it in previous sessions, but that's really the heart and soul of the strategy matrix as well, because you're constantly asking, what strategy alternative would bust the main bottleneck to achieving our aspiration? And then the rest is all tools for doing that and design principles for how to find that.
Let's share a couple of things. You talked about some of the ways you find bottlenecks through five whys, fishbones, Lean Six Sigma, and heat maps. But you also share where to look for bottlenecks.
And those examples you gave of techniques you can use, there's many more. There's some great things that consultants bring and people who help with strategy process and kind of creativity sessions. There's so many that can be used. But yes, there are also some principles around making sure you've got the right bottleneck. There's several. One of them is it can't just be a restatement of the aspiration. Our aspiration is our cost has gotten out of control and we need to control it. We need to reduce our cost. Our bottleneck is that we're in the bottom quintile in our industry in cost. Just a restatement of the aspiration adds no information. Another rule is the bottleneck cannot be impossibly hard or ridiculously easy to bust, or else you're wasting your time. If it's impossibly hard, there's nothing you can do. Now, you can debate that. You can discuss that, and maybe someone will be right, someone will be wrong about that. But if you conclude it's impossible to bust, then why bother? The example I always like is the Navy has to reduce its costs. The Navy is being demanded they reduce their budget by hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. And the Navy says, yeah, but look at all of these theaters of operation you expect us to work in. If you would reduce the number of places we have to be in every ocean and every great sea, the Mediterranean Sea and the Middle East and the North Atlantic and South Pacific, take one away and we can reduce it. And then, of course, the politicians would say, sorry, that's not on the table. Well, then you can sit in your office and complain about how that bottleneck of having too many things you have to do is keeping you from reducing your costs, but it's a worthless exercise because you can't change it. Now, you can try, but you got to decide whether it's worth it. Too easy is the example of we've got to reduce costs. The bottleneck is we haven't told everybody yet. Well, just tell everybody. Do you really need a thing for that? But then the subtlety in that one is, what if the organization is used to every quarter or every half a year that we have a cost emergency and that we've got to do something? Now maybe it is a bottleneck. Maybe the bottleneck is not that we have to tell everybody or everybody doesn't know. It's that they're so sick of hearing about it that it doesn't mean anything anymore. Now we have to come up with a strategy that would get people to believe that it's really going to happen. There's other features of bottlenecks that are important to keep in mind. I would say another important one is it's crucial to think of people when you're thinking of bottlenecks, that it's not just assets, it's not just a lack of money. I think theory of constraints, there's a great alliance between theory of constraints and the way Goldratt originated that process and that model of the world and the emergent approach. There's a great alliance because we're both focused on that central constraint, that system constraint, what I call the bottleneck, what he called the system constraint. But they limited themselves often to measurable flow quantities or measurable asset quantities. And yet, I think anybody knows that in a business, emotional things, people issues, complexity, understanding, jealousy, conflicts of interest, conflicts of how you look good or not look bad. All these things are true bottlenecks often in a company. And those have to be addressed by strategy. Or your strategy that's addressing some technical issue around products also has to address the fact that people have all of these feelings and all of these emotions around how the company is moving forward.
I love that you said that about the people thing. And Peter gives loads of examples in the book. For example, your sales team are underperforming. The misdiagnosis is often that, oh, they're just underperforming, and you go, well, maybe they don't have the right training, etc., etc. So you go exploring for the bottlenecks. I'm going to share, Peter, if that's all right, another example that you have from the book. So there's a great example that Peter uses throughout the entire book of this made up company called Courier Incorporated. And again, I'm showing on the screen here the aspiration, bottlenecks, strategy, and how that would work and how you'd actually map this. Because when you see it like this, and again, a little bit of empathy for those people who are just listening, Peter.
This is that triad I was referring to, the aspiration, bottleneck, strategy triad. And imagine in your head, on the right-hand side is the aspiration. In this case, it was this company, Courier, that was trying to consider how to enter a new market. And that was their aspiration. But as is shown throughout, you can't, because you can't directly achieve aspirations, you have to work backwards to all of the possible choices that you might have to do that. All your choices in marketing, operations, legal, financing, HR, hiring, you name it, all the things that are involved in a business, countless choices. And as argued earlier in our sessions, a strategy is that central rule that's designed to bring all those choices together in a coherent way to attack the bottleneck. And what this picture shows is that you can start brainstorming, you can start thinking about, well, what's really in the way of moving to this new market by listing underneath this bottleneck label in this diagram. And I forgot to add, the diagram unfolds from right to left. So imagine it like a big V on the side with the closed end on the right side and the open end on the left side. And that represents this influence diagram where you go from a single aspiration and it leads to countless choices. And what we're now overlaying on that is let's think about all the possibilities that of what's really in the way to this aspiration. And so some of the ones here, uncertainty of drone approval for love potions. Okay, I walked into it here. I even use a silly example of they're transporting love potions and whether or not you will be allowed to use drones for love potions. We don't always have to be so serious, do we? Costs of a vehicle fleet, competitive response, uncertainty of regulation. All of these things are possible, the real bottleneck that the strategy must address. And then you can now at the end of this V, where you would have all those choices and where you need a strategy that will bring them all together to be coherent, you could start talking about what your central rule might be that could bust the bottlenecks. Now, here, you're just exploring possibilities. Slowly but surely, you got to solve this puzzle. And you can now transfer you can transfer these possible strategies and pick a few of these bottlenecks and explore them in the SAM and fight it out. We have a section on fitness criteria, and then there's a section on assessments. How does everybody in our organization assess these bottlenecks and these potential strategies against what we care about? How do the people on the front lines How do the people in the various organizations of the company? We need to take the time to get everybody to internalize this and to figure out what really is the issue. So, yes, summing up, the aspiration bottleneck strategy triad is really the heart and soul of finding your strategy framework. Your framework will include other things, plans and goals, sub goals and metrics and forecasts and scenarios, but this is the heart of it. And you can solve a puzzle with these tools. And the bottleneck truly is the the magic to finding the strategy. The bottleneck is the glue.
Peter, I've one for you, and this is live for me at the moment. So I was telling you, and I haven't announced it yet, the reinventionsummit.com. So we're doing this next year, April 29 and 30, Dublin, the Royal Dublin Convention Centre. Seth Godin is confirmed, Charles Kahn, chairman of Patagonia, is confirmed, Elvin Turner, myself, Nadia Jeksembayeva, who's my co-founder in this. Our aspirations. I've been using the tools you've been giving me live here. So the aspiration is to create an event that is not just talking heads, it's not just inspiration, it's learning, it's coming away, it's at this interface of inspiration and action. And I was thinking about the bottlenecks, and I was like going, am I confusing sometimes bottlenecks with hurdles? So what I mean there is, like, some of the bottlenecks I sketched down for myself would be getting executive time, or an abundance of events that were competing for that executive time. And then the possible strategies is, like, you're talking about marketing, you're talking about guerrilla marketing, etc. Is that the right way of thinking about that? Because I'm using this live.
I think those are potentially. I think your aspiration to do something different immediately in my mind, if I was on this in a session, in a design session with you, the first thing that probably would come to my mind is, even if you came up with a great, and I'm sure you are, came up with a great format to achieve that, that it's not just a bunch of talking heads. How would you convey to people that that's true? Because it's going to look on the surface like a lot of other meetings, unless you find a way to convey that it's different. And that may not be so simple. Now, I would start and say, well, that's one possible bottleneck. That's a big issue. And by the way, very important point. Some people will say, how can you say there's only one bottleneck? I'm not saying there's only one bottleneck. I'm saying that there is one dominant bottleneck in a system almost always. Smaller bottlenecks can be managed with tactical rules. So, for example, let's say a second bottleneck in your program is, and I what was the other one you gave? I want to go with the ones you did.
So executive time would be a huge one. Competing
Okay,
events
so
would be a huge
getting
one.
executives to come. Yeah, maybe that's very heavily related to the marketing. I don't know. Maybe a third bottleneck is getting all of the presenters to agree on how this would work, because they're used to doing their thing, right? So another bottleneck would go on the list of, how do we make sure we're coherent? How do we make sure that they've bought into this process? We're not going to trial it. It's going to be the first time we do it. Here we go. Say you believe that to be the central bottleneck, and that you really had to invest time in not only working with these people before the meeting, and, and designing it in a way that they could accept and feel good about. That doesn't mean that the marketing and convincing people that they should spend their time and that this is different isn't a bottleneck. You would solve that with a separate set of work. And it might even be what we call nested strategies, right? You have an overall strategy for the program design, and then you have another strategy system for addressing the bottleneck of, how are people going to be convinced that this is different? when we all see a huge number of advertisements for sessions like this. So I really want to be clear that the dominant bottleneck doesn't mean there's not other bottlenecks, but usually there's one that really is the most important. And discovering that is so much a part of strategy effort and strategy design and innovation in general. What's really in the way? So I think very connected to what you were just showing. If I was on a design team with you guys, it would be okay. We want to we have this vision, this aspiration to do something different here, and we think we know we can do it. Okay, let's start asking what's in the way, and you already articulated three really good things that have to be addressed in some way.
And and you recognize one which is huge, which is it is how do you say that through the medium of a PowerPoint or a PDF? Because people are kind of going, yeah, yeah, yadika, yadika. Everybody's different, and there's a lot of trust and relationships that needed to be built in order to be able to get sponsorships over the line, get speakers over the line. And to your point as well, is that you may nail it on year one, but that doesn't mean it's going to translate into year two. So this is where all this is so helpful when you actually bring it to life. I wanted to share one other. Thank you for
No, it's a
humoring me
great,
on that,
it's a
Peter.
terrific
I just
example. It really is.
yeah, and by the way, we might get Peter, we might convince Peter over for those. So let me know if you want Peter over. If you're willing to sponsor him to come over, get in touch. Moving on. This one just spoke volumes to me. I worked in an organization very briefly, and I was head of innovation. And I didn't do my homework, didn't go in there. I believed the hype about, I drank the Kool Aid about this place is trying to change, etc., etc. Happens hundreds of people every year. They go into these jobs, transformation officers, etc. And I pretty much discovered, I was like going, this place, it's not ready for innovation. It actually needs a red wedding. Do you
I'm
know that idea of
I'm
the red
sorry,
wedding, the
I
Chinese?
don't. Tell me.
Oh, you love this, man. So it was brought to life in Game of Thrones, but it's actually a true story where the different states were in such battle with each other that one family brings all the families together and decides to make peace and goes, "Let's have a peace." Is his daughter's wedding, and then slaughters everybody. And the whole idea was like, you have to start from scratch, right? So in my exit interview, I was asked, "What would you do, though? What would you do?" And I was like, "Oh, well, I'd I'd orchestrate a red wedding." And then I read, I, then I,
They
and
didn't
the
hear
guy
that too
laughed,
often in
but
exit reviews, no.
no, no, they didn't hear the truth too often. But this is when you say, okay, what happens when the whole system is broken? So you look for the bottlenecks and you discover, oh my God, these are not bottlenecks. This is bags of snakes. And you need to find the root causes. And what Peter says here is systems in which many bottlenecks are seemingly in play and many symptoms of failure are visible can be called systemically broken. Everything is a mess, and leaders may be caught in a perpetual game of whack a mole, dealing with symptoms as they arise. In such situations, it may be challenging to discover the real cause, the root cause of the problems, and therefore, what is the bottleneck to fixing that root cause? Maybe you'll describe a little bit there. What do you do if you find yourself in that case? And it's more common than we give credit to. This happens a lot for organizations. Leader comes in and goes, "Oh, I wish I could just begin this time all afresh."
It is more common than we might think. I often think about a plant site, a factory where quality is bad and work stoppages are bad and waste and yield are bad and safety performance and environmental performance. They're all on the edge and going in and out of success and failure, and the plant manager is all they can do is address the next wave that's going to hit them, right, as they're trying to get up on the beach and take a look around and really try to do something systematic, and they can't, right? Because every other day there's an event. Uh, I mean, obviously, the bottleneck is something much deeper about either the discipline of the organization. Like immediately, I jump to, is it are the procedures right? Are the standard operating procedures right? Is the technology right? Are the safety procedures correct? And we're not following them? And that it's a systemic habit of the organization to be lackadaisical and think they don't need to follow the rules? Or is it the standard operating procedures are outdated? They've never modified for new products and new raw materials and a new type of workforce that doesn't have the same experience. Whatever, we can make up so many different cases. Which of those two? Like, start there. Which is it? Is it that it's not clear what to do, or is it we're not following what to do? Right away, I would jump to the bottleneck is at first, I don't even know what the problem is. The problem is certainly not that our quality's bad and yields are bad. That's all symptoms now, right? My first bottleneck is I don't even know what the real problem is. And can I bring somebody in here to help me? Or is there somebody in the site that can help me figure that out? But of course, there's an enormous bottleneck there too. No one's got time to do anything like that because you're busy solving every emergency, right? So then maybe you appeal to the business leader and say, can you give me some resources to figure this out? Are the standard operating procedures correct? Are we really following them? And approach it this way. I think systemically broken does not mean there isn't a central bottleneck. It's just that that central bottleneck, that dominant bottleneck, is at a much higher level, much more abstract level than, well, we don't have a good test for quality, and therefore that's why our quality keeps coming out of spec. Or we don't have a good controller on the reactor, and that's why our quality's out of spec. That could be the bottleneck. Might be something very, very hard to do. And that actually solving that bottleneck requires a big strategy. But that's not a systemically broken problem.
we we originally said we'll do 2 episodes, and I still have tons of notes here, but I'm not doing it to Peter. We're gonna part ways, but hopefully we'll connect again in the future. Maybe in April next year, Peter, if you're around Europe as well. And it's been an absolute pleasure, man. There's so much more I wanted to get through, but I actually think it's easier to read it, which is stuff. There's stuff in there on generic strategies. You go further into fitness criteria about understanding numbers and don't be have an uber love of numbers, which kills so much innovation. Putting financial metrics on it, traditional metrics on innovation, absolute killer. There's loads in here. It does take time to read it. I do think reading it and having the accompaniment of a show and then Peter's notes is a great way to learn it. It is a game changer if you actually get this. I showed it myself there with the Reinvention Summit, has me thinking in a different way. And Peter, before we wrap, where is the best place for people who don't know by now to find you and find out more?
Of course, the book's available on Amazon.com and other online retail outlets around the world. You can go to emergentapproach.com for supplemental material, examples, and also task sets that bring to life this puzzle building that we've talked about. And I'm going to mention we're working on bringing them out as a paper book with added examples and more guidance on how to do this puzzle. And then you can find me on LinkedIn, Peter Compo LinkedIn, and I post often and give little vignettes on these topics that we've covered. And you can contact me there or through the website. Glad to hear from anybody. Positive or negative feedback always makes us better.
Absolutely, and I love if you could get away with this, have no picture on the cover of the book.
You know what? That is a great idea. I I why didn't I think now you're showing your skills. I should have thought about that, a book with no picture.
I I wouldn't have thought of that at the start. I
That's
wouldn't have thought of
beautiful.
that
I
at the
gotta
start.
tell my guys that.
Man, do you know what? Actually, I probably got that idea from. I'm just looking for it there. Carol Tavris. I had Carol Tavris on the show, and her book is called "Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Us." Mistakes were made, but not by me. I can't see the cover there, but essentially,
Oh,
the cover
okay.
is upside down on purpose.
As a gag,
So it's
as a
printed
gag.
wrong on purpose.
Oh,
Yeah, exactly.
there's no picture. What is it then?
Well, I wondered, could you have emergent, like the writing kind of
Ah,
emerging,
yeah,
as in
yeah,
it's not
yeah,
faded or something. It's faded
yeah, who
left to
knows?
right or
Well, we'll
something.
think
I don't
about
know.
that. You gave me a great idea.
Man, I just want to say absolute pleasure. And I I want to tell our audience behind the scenes, Peter, absolute legend of a guy, great guy, a brother from another mother. I've connected with him over the airwaves here like this, and it's been an absolute pleasure. I'll also link to everything, all his music on YouTube, everything. So all these pieces make the man as well. So Peter, thank you for joining us
Well,
over the
I
past
thank
few
you,
weeks.
Aidan, because you put your heart and soul into this, and you allow it to go into depth, and you allow real issues to come out, and that's really a valuable offering.
Thank you, man. Thank you very much. I'm going to press stop now. See you soon.